Good morning. My name is Pastor Corey. I'm the transition pastor here at Kent Cove. It's good to be with you again. This morning, we are continuing our series in the deeply formed life, and we are also doing part 2 of a little two-part thing that we started a couple weeks ago on Psalm 139. So our text this morning is Psalm 139, and it reads like this: "You have searched me, Lord, and know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space where heaven and earth meet. Amen. Well, Psalm 139 covers a lot of ground, right? And so the first part of this sermon that we talked about 2 weeks ago, I talked to you about this idea of what God's disposition towards us is, and this idea of how we might respond with fear or anxiety to God's knowledge of us. That is, if we are afraid of God. And we talked about how Jesus is the perfect picture of the Father. And so if we want to know what God's disposition towards us and towards humankind is, we need only look at Jesus and the way that he treated people to know who God is. And we know that it is not necessary for us to flee from God. For, first of all, as the psalm makes clear, it's pointless. We can't. And second of all, God is simply seeking to love us. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we could look at this text, and we could spend a lot of time in this psalm. But I want to jump to the end. So we looked at the first kind of third of the psalm 2 weeks ago. We're going to kind of skip the middle third, and we're going to pick up the last third this morning. And we're going to look primarily at verses 19 to the end of the psalm. And there are some reasons for that. The first is verse 19 shows us a very abrupt change in tone. Yes? Oh God, you have made me fearfully and wonderfully. I praise your works. The things that you do are amazing. You make amazing things. You know everything. God, please crush my enemies and destroy them. They are foul, and I'm really upset." Right? "If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty." It's like, whoa, dude. That's a hard right turn, right? I mean, David takes a very different, just kind of seemingly out of nowhere here. And it's problematic because we hear these words and we think, we struggle with this, right? Because first of all, we as Christians, I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, and maybe it's just me, but I don't think so. We tend to have some problems with strong emotions, right? We tend to like to just lock those things down, keep them in there, because you can't be honest about that stuff. To which I would say maybe you need to read some more of the Psalms, because this is light. There's some other stuff that'll really turn your head. "If only you, God, would slay the wicked." And then he goes on and talks about, "Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies." David clearly is upset, and he is feeling persecuted. And one of the things that we struggle with here is that word hate. It's a very strong word, right? And we know that we are, when Jesus was quizzed about what is the teacher, the greatest commandment, Jesus' answer was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So we shouldn't say that we hate anyone. David is clearly really in a place of deep emotion and deep pain. And a couple things we can say about this that, in some ways soften the language of hate and this kind of othering that David is doing at this point. But partly I think we can't explain that away. It's there. It's in the text. We've got to sit with it and recognize that the Bible, for as much as it is an inspired book, and it is, as we say in the covenant, the only rule for faith, doctrine, and conduct, there are some complex and difficult texts and things that we have to wrestle with. And the word hate here is really the motivator of this word is zealousness for God. Not so much hatred of the other, but zealousness for the things of God. Wanting to do things right. Wanting to make sure that we are honoring God. But it's very clear also that David is directing this to an enemy or a foe. It's someone that is against him. And we know that David was being pursued as before he became king by Saul's army. All of these challenges that he faced that we could understand. Probably most of us have not gone through that level of persecution, but we've all gone through some stuff, and we can all recognize how we feel when we feel like we're being attacked. Right? And so that brings up all these strong emotions. And so David is venting those things to God. And the wicked that he's talking about are clearly, making choices and doing things that David understands to be on the wrong side of history, as we would like to say these days. They're destructive and scheming. But notice something that happens here. The first is that David has a choice to make as a leader. Right? As he engages these feelings and he names them, which I would argue is the healthy thing to do. Right? Were David a 21st century pastor, he might bury those down, soften it up, come up with some other language, although there are maybe some examples of that, as I say that, people not doing that. But softening it, right? But David is honest about his emotions. He's honest about the state of his heart. And he has a choice as a leader to either really lean into that honesty about the state of his heart and where he finds himself and what he's facing, or to become the monster that he opposes. Right? Because that really is our choice as humans. When we face the kind of persecution and we are afraid and filled with anxiety, which we'll come back to in a minute, like David is at this point, we have basically two options. We can lean into that discomfort and figure out why and give it to God, or we can become the thing that we despise. And if you want proof of that, just open pretty much any history book and follow the arc of history, where oppressed becomes oppressor, where revolutionary fighting for freedom becomes despot, right? I mean, it happens over and over again. It's just that bent in us towards brokenness. And that's the thing that's amazing about this hymn. David does not limit his abhorrence of evil to others. He turns inward. And this is perhaps a callback to the very beginning of this psalm. If you remember, verse 1, "You have searched me, Lord, and know me." Right? And then at the end of the psalm, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." That verse jumped out at me in the context of everything that we as a wider society have been through in the last several years. And I think even especially speaks to where Kent Cove is as a church. There are things that can bring anxiety for us, uncertainties, things that we don't know, and things that we do know. Well, we've already talked about the fact that when David is penning this psalm, he is under attack. He's facing persecution. He's being chased. And our tendency as humans is to retaliate. We know what needs to happen and what is right, and we're more than happy to put it into action. Some of you may remember the singer Rich Mullins. One of my favorite clips of him that I saw in a video once was him talking about in the Psalms where it says that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And he joked and said, "And I just want to be about the Lord's business." Right? I mean, that's really when we're in the place where David is, when we're feeling anxiety, when we're feeling attacked, that's where we go almost naturally, right? It's like, well, I know what God wants, and I'm more than happy to impose it on you. But David turns to God and he says, "Search me, God. Know my heart. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Or in the ancient way, which is a callback to the prophet Jeremiah. David recognizes the importance of self-examination and allowing and leaning into that discomfort. It's not posturing. David is opening himself up to God's examination, I think in some innate recognition that if he does not, he will end up someplace he doesn't want to be. And so when we find ourselves in that situation, we invite the Spirit to do its work in us. And how do we do that? Well, we could simply pray the words of the last couple verses of this psalm. That would be one practice. Another practice that we might try is the ancient Ignatian practice of examine. If you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to Google that and look it up. It's a great way to kind of lean into what it is that you're feeling and why it is that you're, maybe responding the way that you are. We're not going to go through that this morning, but it's one that I commend to you. But the thing that really jumped out at me in this psalm as we think about what it means to examine ourselves is verse 23. "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." How many of you have felt anxious in the last 5 minutes? Or 5 years? Right? I mean, our culture, friends, is riddled with anxiety. And we can pretend like it's not, but it's everywhere. We're bleeding all over each other with anxiety. This is a verse for our times, if there ever was one. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Here's a definition for you of anxiety or anxious thoughts. Therapist and pastor Peter Steinke notes two types of anxiety, acute and chronic. Acute anxiety is situational and time-based. It is a momentary loss of self-composure and poise. Chronic anxiety is not specific to a threat. Any issue, topic, or circumstance can provoke chronically anxious people. Consequently, they have little capacity to step out of their experience, observe their own emotionality, reflect on what is happening, make choices based on principles, and manage their lives. I might just stop right there. So let me just unpack this real quick. So acute anxiety is kind of that when you lose your cool, right? You're in a heated exchange with your spouse or a friend or whatever, and you just pop off and say whatever comes in your mind, and you come back hard, right? That's acute. It's a momentary loss of self-composure and poise. Chronic anxiety. Listen again to this definition of chronic anxiety. Any issue, topic, or circumstance can provoke chronically anxious people. Does that sound like anybody we know? Consequently, they have little capacity to step out of their experience, observe their own emotionality, reflect on what is happening, make choices based on principles, and manage their lives. Friends, if there was ever a description of where we find ourselves in America in the 21st century at this point in time, it's this. We see it everywhere. But here's the thing. I don't say that to simply for us to sit back and go, oh yeah, look at how messed up they are. No, as that old comic used to say, I have seen the enemy and he is us. We're all anxious. This psalm is so important for us to lean into. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Because the only way that we can deal with our chronic anxiety is to open our hearts to God and to allow Him to show us what we need to do to be formed and discipled into the way of Jesus. The only way to do that is we must confront our anxiety. One of the first things I learned many years ago, the first time I went into therapy when I was about 16 or 17, has served me well my entire life, and that is that therapy is worthless if you're not honest with yourself. And I think that lesson is so important because it applies to our lives of faith as well. It applies to our spiritual journey. A spiritual journey or faith is worthless to us if we're not honest about where we are. If we're not willing to be honest about where we are and to allow God to see and know us, then no amount of faith or belief or Bible verses or doctrine or anything will cure us. We have to be honest and allow God to enter into our hearts and to help us to face those places where we are broken, those things that make us anxious. So a couple of simple things that we can do. Pastor Rich, in the book, The Deeply Formed Life, asked this question: who and what situations make me anxious? Right? Who and what situations make me anxious? This could be a dangerous question because it invites us right into it. Right? I mean, to not push too hard, but I think a great example would be, just over a year ago when the whole George Floyd thing happened. That situation made a lot of people really anxious, right? Now, unfortunately, the response generally is not to lean into that anxiety and go, why am I anxious about this? And ask the hard questions that follow, but to simply react, right? Or maybe it's a situation in your family or here at church or wherever it might be where it clearly makes you anxious, but instead of leaning into that anxiety and figuring out what is it about this that's really pushing my buttons, we just go into reaction mode. Right? Which brings us to tough step number 2, which is reactions, or as some people like to call them, feelings. Gretchen's laughing because I have one feeling. Feelings are my least favorite thing. I think a lot of them. You'll get that later. But the helpful thing to do with this is, if we are feeling anxious, and this again is from Pastor Rich in his book, The Deeply Formed Life, he has this practice that he uses that asks 5 questions to help us lean into anxiety, right? The first is, what happened? The second is, what am I feeling? Don't like that question. Number 3, what is the story I'm telling myself? You guys realize that, right? This was a revelation to me that about 10 years ago I met someone who is now one of my very best friends. And he used to always use this phrase. He'd always, when we were talking about things, he would always say, well, what do I make up about that? And I always thought it was the weirdest thing. And so we had this long conversation about it. And it's essentially this. We all make up stories in our head about what's happening to us. And the hard thing is that the vast majority of the stories we make up in our head about what's happening to us are not true, even though we act like they are, right? So what is the story I'm telling myself? The 4th, what does the gospel say? And then the 5th, what counter-instinctual action is needed? Right? So if we apply this to the psalm that we just read at the end where David says, after calling out his enemies and naming this very clear anger that he has, his counter-instinctual action is to turn to God and say, search me and know me. Examine my anxious heart. Know my anxious thoughts. Test me. Show me the way of life everlasting. Lead me in the way everlasting. So David's counter-instinctual action is to, instead of take action against those enemies that he very clearly knows who they are and what they've done wrong, his counter-instinctual action is to lean into God and say, search me and know me and teach me the way, the ancient ways. We would say it, search me and know me and teach me the way of Jesus. Help me to lean into a counter-instinctual way of being. Friends, as we look at what it means to do self-examination, there are a lot of different practices that you can use. There are a lot of different ways that we can face with honesty where we find ourselves in life. But I am convinced that this is a hinge point for our faith. That if we don't learn the practice of self-examination, then we are just a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal, as Paul says. Because the only thing we will ever do, if we don't submit ourselves to self-examination and allow God to show us where we're broken, all we'll ever do is respond like David did, but before he turns to God. We'll just react and react and react. And no amount of doctrine, no amount of theology, no amount of memorized scripture verses, all of the things that we like to rely on to feel like we're making progress in our spiritual life, if we don't lean into this step of self-confession, we will never be formed in the way of Jesus. Because it's all about grace. We all have it. We all hear this psalm, and when David takes that hard right turn and says, I hate your enemies, I'm going to crush them. They are the worst. Those Republicans, I'm going to get those Democrats. Just fill in whichever blank it is that sets you up, right? And we know what's best. We know how to fix everything, right? Except we don't. We need to turn to God and say, search me and know me. It made me also think, in relation to coming to the table in a few minutes, of these hard words of Jesus in Luke that we like to trot out when it's convenient and when we don't have to lean into our own things. But he says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother or sister, let me take the speck out of your eye, when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Friends, much like Rich Mullins quoting the Psalms, oftentimes when we read this, I think we just want to be about the Lord's business. Brother, let me help you with that log or that speck, right? But we have to turn to God and say, God, search me and know me. Show me my anxious thoughts. Lead me in the way everlasting. Form me more into the image of your Son, Jesus. I can't do it myself. My response is anger and rage. But I desperately want to experience and to share your love. So first I have to face my own demons and my own brokenness. God, give me the courage to step in, to examine it, and then to lean in to you and your goodness and your love and your grace and your mercy, so that I don't destroy everyone around me. Friends, we have the opportunity every day to begin again. Every day to lean into God and to ask Him to show us our anxious thoughts, to transform us. And it's my prayer that we would learn more and more to allow God to take that anger and those anxious thoughts and to use them to transform us first. Because we sure want to be about the Lord's business. But if we haven't done our own work first, it's not going to happen. And there's a reason it's called the Lord's business anyways. So friends, as we move to the table, I just ask that you would consider what it might look like for you to pray with David, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Amen.